Donald Trump says tariff is his favorite word in the dictionary. But what happens when other countries start putting import taxes on American products?
In less than 9 months, a single trade war decision triggered the loss of more than 72,000 manufacturing jobs tied to the United States economy, redirected hundreds of billions of dollars in industrial investment away from American soil, and quietly shifted the center of North American production toward Canada and overseas markets, a shock large enough to alter global supply chains and rattle financial confidence far beyond factory floors. Factories did not come home. They crossed borders. As the United States destabilized its own industrial base, Canada emerged as the primary beneficiary, absorbing jobs, investment, and long-term production capacity at a scale unseen in decades. What began as a trade war intended to strengthen American sovereignty instead exposed a far more dangerous reality: the loss of trust. Today, if you listen through to the very end, I will expose a decision buried deep inside this tariff strategy, a decision so damaging that its full economic cost was never disclosed to the public, a decision that quietly accelerated the collapse of manufacturing, employment, amplified capital flight, and locked in losses far greater than officials ever acknowledged. This hidden trigger did not merely worsen the trade war. It transformed it into one of the most destructive policy miscalculations in modern United States industrial history. The real damage of the trade war did not begin on factory floors. It began at the border, quietly, mathematically, and with devastating precision. When tariffs of 25 to 50% were imposed across steel, aluminum, automotive components, industrial machinery, and electronic inputs, the cost shock did not hit once. It multiplied. Internal cost models used by manufacturers across the United States revealed that for complex goods such as vehicles, heavy equipment, and industrial systems, the effective input cost inflation reached between 38 and 61% within months. This was not inflation driven by demand. It was inflation engineered by policy. American manufacturers attempted to absorb the shock. During the first half of 2025, companies carried nearly 80% of tariff-related costs on their balance sheets, hoping the trade war would be temporary. It was not. By late summer, margins collapsed. By early autumn, production slowed. By winter, layoffs accelerated. The most vulnerable layer broke first. Tier 2 and Tier 3 suppliers, the backbone of American manufacturing, operated on margins below 6% even before tariffs. By the final quarter of 2025, more than 1,900 small and mid-sized industrial suppliers either suspended operations, entered restructuring, or quietly shut down. Each closure removed a critical link in the supply chain. Assembly plants soon followed. Just-in-time logistics failed. Production lines halted, not because of weak demand, but because components were unavailable or prohibitively expensive. Capacity utilization across United States manufacturing fell below 72%, a contraction level historically associated with deep industrial downturns. While factories stalled, global competitors moved. Orders were rerouted. Contracts were rewritten. Investment committees stopped asking whether to leave the United States and started deciding how fast. Canada absorbed a growing share of this displacement, offering stable policy, predictable trade access, and insulation from tariff volatility. What the trade war expelled, Canada quietly accepted. This was the moment when the trade war stopped being a political experiment and became a structural fracture. Because what most Americans never saw was the internal decision made next, a decision that magnified these losses, protected insiders, and triggered an even larger wave of job destruction that has still not been fully disclosed. By the time the first factory closures made headlines, the damage was already far deeper than most Americans realized. What appeared to be a manufacturing slowdown was, in reality, the early phase of a nationwide employment shock set in motion by the trade war. Between April 2025 and the end of the year, manufacturing payrolls tied directly to tariff exposed supply chains declined without interruption. More than 72,000 factory jobs disappeared in less than 9 months. But that figure concealed a far more severe reality. Manufacturing in the United States does not exist in isolation. Every factory job supports transportation workers, warehouse staff, maintenance crews, equipment technicians, raw material handlers, and local service economies. Internal labor market models used by regional Federal Reserve banks showed that for every one manufacturing job lost, between 1.4 and 2.2 additional jobs were placed at risk. When secondary effects were included, the total employment impact surged past 110,000 jobs by early 2026. Entire regional labor markets began to buckle. The Midwest absorbed the heaviest blow. Industrial counties that had not experienced sustained job losses since the early 1980s suddenly faced double-digit employment contractions. Southern manufacturing hubs that had grown rapidly during the globalization era saw foreign-owned facilities freeze hiring or quietly prepare exit strategies. These were not temporary furloughs. Severance packages replaced paychecks. Training budgets vanished. Skilled workers began leaving the labor force altogether. At the household level, the consequences were immediate and severe. As factories cut shifts and suppliers shut down, household income dropped sharply in communities already vulnerable to inflation. At the same time, prices surged. By early 2026, average consumer prices for appliances rose by more than 11%. Construction materials climbed between 14 and 18%. Automotive replacement parts increased by nearly 20%. These increases were not driven by corporate greed. They were the mechanical outcome of tariffs compounding through fractured supply chains. The effective cost burden imposed on American households exceeded $1,300 per year, with lower-income families absorbing a disproportionate share. Consumer confidence weakened. Credit card balances expanded rapidly. Auto loan delinquencies began to rise. Retail foot traffic declined. Secondary layoffs spread from factories into logistics centers, distribution hubs, and regional transport networks. While the United States economy weakened from the inside, capital did not wait for official confirmation. Investment flowed out. Orders moved north. Canada absorbed production lines, workforce relocations, and long-term contracts at a pace unseen in decades. What the trade war destroyed in the United States, Canada stabilized and rebuilt. But the most dangerous phase was still ahead. Because as jobs vanished and prices rose, a far more destabilizing shift began quietly unfolding inside financial markets, one that would threaten borrowing costs, government finances, and the very foundation of economic confidence. By early 2026, the trade war had moved beyond factories and households and entered a far more dangerous phase. Confidence began to fracture inside financial markets. This was the moment when economic damage stopped being local and became systemic. For decades, the United States benefited from an assumption that few investors ever questioned. No matter how severe a policy mistake might be, the system would eventually correct itself. That assumption quietly collapsed as tariffs remained in place despite mounting evidence of failure. Investors adjusted not emotionally, but mathematically. Foreign holders of United States government debt began to rebalance portfolios away from dollar-denominated assets. This shift was gradual, deliberate, and deeply unsettling. Even small reductions in demand for government bonds forced yields higher. Each incremental increase in borrowing costs translated into tens of billions of dollars in additional annual interest expenses for the federal government. At the same time, private capital accelerated its retreat. Manufacturing investment into the United States declined sharply as corporations rewrote long-term plans. Projects scheduled for the Midwest, the Great Lakes region, and the Industrial South were delayed, downsized, or canceled entirely. Boardrooms stopped treating the United States as the default production base and began viewing it as a high-risk jurisdiction. Canada emerged as the primary destination for this redirected capital. Stable trade access, predictable regulation, and insulation from tariff volatility transformed Canada into the preferred North American anchor for long-term industrial investment. New production corridors expanded across Ontario, Quebec, and Western Canada. Logistics routes shifted east-west instead of north-south, What once flowed naturally into the United States was rerouted with intent. The fiscal consequences for the United States compounded rapidly. As manufacturing output declined and consumer demand weakened under rising prices, tax revenues underperformed projections by hundreds of billions of dollars. At the same time, higher borrowing costs inflated debt servicing expenses. The result was a widening fiscal gap that required even more borrowing at precisely the moment global appetite for United States debt was softening. This feedback loop was lethal. Tariffs raised costs. Costs destroyed margins. Margin collapse triggered layoffs. Layoffs reduced demand. Reduced demand weakened revenue. Weakened revenue increased borrowing. Increased borrowing collided with declining investor confidence. Each stage reinforced the next. Canada, watching from across the border, did not need to respond publicly. Markets responded on its behalf. Capital did not flee North America. It simply chose stability over chaos. And yet, even this was not the most severe consequence, because the final stage of this trade war was not about jobs or capital flows. It was about permanence. Supply chains were being redesigned, contracts rewritten, and trust reallocated in ways that would not reverse with a single policy change. By mid-2026, the trade war had crossed a threshold that economists consider the most dangerous point in any industrial crisis. Supply chains were no longer adjusting, they were being rewritten. Internal logistics assessments circulated among global manufacturers showed that more than 40% of North American production networks that once routed through the United States had been permanently redesigned to bypass it entirely. These were not contingency plans. They were finalized contracts, fixed infrastructure investments, and long-term workforce commitments measured in decades, not quarters. The economic cost of this shift was staggering. Manufacturing output losses tied directly to tariff-exposed industries exceeded $600 billion on an annualized basis. When secondary effects were included, including logistics, warehousing, equipment servicing, and industrial finance, total output losses approached $1 trillion across the United States economy. This was not a slowdown, it was an extraction. Employment followed output. By late summer 2026, cumulative job losses linked directly or indirectly to the trade war exceeded 400,000 positions across manufacturing, transportation, and industrial services. Entire regional economies hollowed out. Industrial counties experienced population decline for the first time in generations as displaced workers relocated or exited the labor force entirely. Public finances deteriorated rapidly. Federal tax receipts fell hundreds of billions of dollars below baseline projections as corporate profits collapsed and household spending weakened. At the same time, higher borrowing costs added more than $300 billion per year in additional debt servicing expenses. The combined fiscal impact approached $900 billion, forcing emergency financing under increasingly unfavorable conditions. While the United States absorbed these losses, Canada experienced the mirror image. Net manufacturing employment gains surpassed 190,000 positions within 18 months. Foreign direct investment inflows exceeded $350 billion, the largest surge in Canadian industrial history. These were not speculative flows. They were steel mills, auto component plants, aerospace subassembly lines, clean energy manufacturing facilities, and defense production contracts relocated or newly built to avoid tariff exposure. Prices told the final story. In the United States, consumer goods inflation driven by supply chain disruption continued to accelerate. Durable goods prices rose at multiples of wage growth. Real purchasing power declined. Household debt expanded at record rates. In Canada, price increases remained contained as diversified trade access stabilized input costs. In some categories, Canadian goods undercut United States prices by more than 20%, reversing decades of cross-border pricing dynamics. This divergence hardened investor behavior. Capital allocation models no longer treated the United States as the default anchor of North American manufacturing. It became a conditional market, subject to political risk premiums and policy unpredictability. Canada by contrast, became the stability hedge. What makes this shift especially dangerous is that it feeds on itself. Once supply chains move, they attract labor. Once labor moves, communities follow. Once communities follow, political influence shifts. And once political influence shifts, policy leverage evaporates. The trade war was supposed to force the world to choose the United States. Instead, it forced the world to choose certainty. And in the next and final part, we will reveal the internal policy mechanism that quietly locked this outcome in place, a decision never publicly debated, never formally announced, and never fully disclosed, yet responsible for turning a reversible mistake into a generational economic loss. What ultimately transformed the trade war from a damaging policy into a generational economic failure was not the tariffs themselves. It was the internal rule change that followed quietly, without public debate, without formal announcement, and without any measurable accountability. As tariff costs surged and political pressure mounted, the administration authorized a selective exemption system designed to shield favored industries from the worst effects. On paper, this was framed as technical relief. In practice, it shattered the last remaining pillar of market stability, predictability. Under this system, exemptions were granted case by case, often retroactively and frequently without clear criteria. Entire categories of manufacturers paid full tariff costs, while competitors received partial or complete relief. Supply contracts became impossible to price, long-term planning collapsed, companies could no longer determine whether future shipments would face zero additional cost or cost increases exceeding 40%. Internal compliance data from customs processing showed that exemption outcomes varied dramatically across identical inputs depending on corporate size, political access, or timing. For manufacturers, this uncertainty proved more destructive than the tariffs themselves. Capital does not fear high costs as much as it fears unknown costs. As a result, firms accelerated exit decisions. Instead of waiting for potential policy reversal, executives moved production to jurisdictions where rules were fixed and transparent. Canada benefited disproportionately. Its regulatory environment offered something the United States no longer did: clarity. Contracts could be signed without contingency clauses. Pricing could be locked. Investment horizons could extend beyond a single election cycle. The economic impact of this hidden mechanism was severe. Modeling conducted by industrial risk analysts showed that exemption-driven uncertainty alone increased capital flight by more than 30% beyond what tariffs would have caused on their own. Manufacturing investment that might have paused instead departed permanently. Jobs that might have been preserved were eliminated preemptively. This is the detail never emphasized publicly. The trade war did not merely raise costs, it replaced rules with discretion. And when discretion replaces rules, markets leave. By late 2026, supply chains had hardened around new realities. Production systems were re-engineered. Workforces were retrained. Infrastructure was built. None of this will unwind quickly. Even a full tariff repeal would not reverse decisions already embedded into software systems, logistics networks, and cross-border industrial planning. The final damage was not measured only in jobs or dollars. It was measured in credibility. The United States signaled to the world that economic policy could change overnight, without warning and without correction. That signal will outlast any single administration. And now comes the final question that policymakers have avoided confronting, the question that determines whether this story ends in recovery or permanent decline. When the dust settles, the outcome of this trade war is no longer ambiguous. It did not restore American manufacturing, it did not strengthen the United States economy, and it did not force the world to bend. Instead, it accelerated job losses, fractured supply chains, destabilized prices, and triggered a reallocation of capital that favored stability over confrontation. The numbers tell a story that rhetoric cannot erase. Hundreds of thousands of jobs displaced, hundreds of billions of dollars in lost output, nearly $1 trillion in combined fiscal damage when lost revenue and higher borrowing costs are counted together. These are not abstract figures. They represent communities hollowed out, households under strain, and an industrial base weakened at a moment when resilience mattered most. Canada did not win by attacking. It won by remaining predictable. While the United States framed trade as a weapon, Canada treated it as infrastructure. While American policy introduced uncertainty, Canada exported clarity. Global markets responded accordingly. This is why the central question facing policymakers now is not whether tariffs should be adjusted, paused, or rebranded. The real question is whether the United States can still persuade the world that it is a reliable place to build, invest, and plan decades into the future. Once that confidence erodes, it does not return easily. Is this moment the beginning of a course correction, or the point at which the United States permanently surrendered its role as the industrial anchor of North America? That answer will shape jobs, prices, and economic security for a generation. Thanks for watching.